Hola a todos, muchas gracias por asistir a esta sesión. Mi nombre es Walter Risi, soy socio de KPMG en Argentina a cargo de la práctica de consulting y a nivel global soy el líder global de ciberseguridad en IoT. Con lo cual, estoy a cargo del desarrollo del portafolio de servicios relacionados con la ciberseguridad en dispositivos físicos. Dentro del mundo de ciberseguridad en IoT, un tema que nos está preocupando particularmente es la ciberseguridad de los dispositivos médicos conectados. Por eso hoy tenemos la presencia de Jane Goebel. Jane es PhD en informática y además es director especialista dentro de la práctica de KPMG UK y está especializada en ciberseguridad de dispositivos médicos, con lo cual los dejo con ella, que les va a contar un poco cuál es el panorama global en cuanto a la ciberseguridad en este terreno particular. Muchas gracias. Jane, over to you.
Muchas gracias, Iwola. So today, thank you, Walter. As Walter just mentioned, I work in the UK and also across the EMEA, the European space, and I focus very much on medical device security. So today, I'm just going to walk you through some of the really big topics around securing the Internet of Medical Device things, what we famously now call the IOMT. Everyone will be aware of IoT and OT, but now we have got some kind of subcategories within that. So I'm going to talk to you through very much about what that means, what that looks like in terms of a security, and also the implications of that across the sector. So where to start off? Well, when we are talking about the Internet of Medical Device things, we are essentially talking about a whole ecosystem of connected medical devices. Now, there are a global set of definitions about what connected medical devices are. But essentially, KPMG have kind of created a harmonized view of that. And that is really about those devices containing configurable embedded computer systems. And those devices are increasingly wireless and connected. Now, before I go into the details of this presentation in front of you, I'm just going to start off with a very interesting fact. So in the medical device sector, what we've got is something called a global nomenclature. So the global nomenclature, let's just say it's a library of devices that have been registered and are recognized globally as being, I suppose, safe and to a certain extent secure. And in that library of recorded medical devices, there are probably in this year about 21,000. All of which different types of categories. You've got heart monitoring, you've got surgical equipment, and everything that falls in between. Now, in that library of that 21,000, you've got a lot of which that traditionally have not been connected to the network or the network that kind of sits in maybe a hospital environment. Now, over the last 3 years, out of that 21,000 list of devices that are registered in this library this year, 60% of those are actually now seen as connected. So what we're seeing is this step change where a lot of the old traditional medical devices, likes of your syringes or likes of your heart monitoring pumps and things like that, these are now being connected for various real reasons in order to improve patient healthcare. What we really want to do globally and what I'm seeing across different I suppose local areas across Argentina, across the UK, across various parts of Europe and also Saudi Arabia, etc. What we're seeing is this real demand to actually improve healthcare with connected devices that actually give us data and insights to the patients. So what we're getting at is a system of devices that historically have been unconnected or standalone or just kind of what we call dumbware, but now are being connected into this ecosystem where all data and statistics and information and insights into that patient are actually being shared. So this is essentially what I mean by this IOMT, the Internet of Medical Device Things. And what we can see now is I've talked about these traditional devices that are now being connected, but you can see the innovation in this area. And this has expanded, especially over the pandemic, actually, because a lot of people have been remote and having to kind of receive a lot of their treatments indoors. Now, that's inspired a lot of medical technology companies, and also to a certain extent biopharma and pharmaceutical companies, to actually start thinking innovatively, creatively about how we deliver health. So they're putting in a lot of investment globally into how we move forward with healthcare, how we create a connected medical device ecosystem. So we're seeing personal healthcare devices, we are seeing innovative disruptive solutions, we're seeing open source initiatives, all of which really changing the face of how we as a global set of organizations are actually moving forward with health. And this is changing the way that services in health are actually being delivered to you. So there's lots of really great examples of these changes, but just some examples around perhaps the way behavioural analysis is actually improving preventive care. So the way we actually use these devices to create insights into the way that you behave and the way that health is being managed can actually help and prevent future kind of illnesses or ailments in themselves. So all of these services now are actually emerging as a repercussion of medical devices. So they are transforming healthcare in all countries across the globe. So what we're seeing now also, in order to build this context of kind of what is the IoT and devices and connected medical device technologies, what we're seeing is that actually it's not just about those devices in the hospital kind of environment. What we're seeing is that the acute care hospitals, which is this tiny box at the top end, where you typically go in and you receive treatment, bedside tablets, and you see things in the actual hospital wards that are helping patients, but actually the connected medical devices are being used in other situations, in other scenarios as well. So they're breaching out of where typically devices have been used. So we're talking about post-acute care. So when you leave the hospital, where do you go? You go home. You might actually go into kind of outpatient care. You might actually go into home care. You might actually be part of the post-surgical kind of processes that are delivered globally. So in those environments, using connected medical device technologies increasingly in terms of wearables and remote care devices. Also in the community, what we call community-based care as well. So what we mean by that is kind of the in-store sensors. We're talking about wellness apps. We're talking about retail pharmacy, the ability to kind of get your prescriptions on demand, that type of thing. Connected medical devices is now bridging. We've got to stop thinking about devices being just within the domain of the hospital. So I mentioned before that we are seeing some great innovation in this sector, huge innovation. Another interesting statistic is that in the last year, there's been 100-fold increase in the number of requests by medical device organisations to actually ask for a patent around their devices themselves. Now, these examples are just a few of my favourites in front of us now, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of a deeper dive into what I mean by innovation, what I mean by connected medical devices. So if we just go for the ERA device up on the top left hand there. So what ERA really is it's an assistive technology that connects the blind with a network via a series of certified agents, and really that person with visual impairment would actually wear the actual goggles themselves, or the spectacles, and those goggles or spectacles are actually connected to an augmented reality dashboard. Now, what those goggles and spectacles do is actually allow that person with visual impairments to actually see through kind of the oral, or kind of the view of kind of listening to what that augmented reality dashboard is telling you. Now, I had the pleasure of kind of testing out an Aira device not so long ago, and it was surreal. You were going through this almost like this Superman kind of situation where the goggles actually kind of connected to that augmented reality dashboard. The series of agents in there were able to kind of use and kind of understand exactly where I was standing and where I was pointing, what the buildings were on my left and on my right. I was basically allowed to see through walls at some point. I was allowed to see kind of what was on the street next to me. Which is great, and that's what I mean by this Superman situation. You can imagine the amount of technology advancement just within Aira itself going forward. So these are just some of the examples. Now, obviously, we've got this big ecosystem, and we've got emerging technologies, and we've got a 100-fold increase in patents for these new technologies. Now, that comes with some concern, I guess, in some situations about the security of those devices themselves. So alongside kind of the increase in those devices, we've also seen an increase in the amount of security concerns with those devices. So one of the most kind of famous examples, you can see a couple of those on the right hand side, but the Medtronic defibrillators, famous, it's kind of newsworthy, and it's been reported globally that the actual devices themselves had a number of vulnerabilities that essentially would allow them to be exploited by attackers. Obviously those with the right knowledge to actually access the device themselves, using kind of close proximity and various different technologies, really accessible on the dark web. But those devices therefore are now considered almost harmful for the patients, and have been recalled actually from the market. So the vulnerabilities do exist. And then I suppose we've got other sets of problems. So not only are there a kind of signs of insecure medical applications and devices, but we've obviously got an increasing kind of concern and set of issues around the sensitive data, the data that is being captured by a lot of these devices. Essentially, I was talking before about the insights that a lot of these devices actually provide back to your GPs or your health practitioners. That sensitive data is something that a lot of attackers actually do want to get hold of, because actually it will in certain ways actually allow them to piece together a social engineering set of attacks and potentially be able to sell that data on the dark web or by other means. Another interesting fact for you is that patient data, or even a health record, is about 15 times more valuable on the dark web than your credit card information. So this is why kind of the healthcare sector and this sensitive data, and the reasons why we're thinking about security, it is actually quite important, because there are an increasing number of attacks. There are attacks targeting to get hold of that data, a lot of privacy concerns, and therefore a real need to kind of step up and improve the security around this. Now, when I talk about the security implications, apologies, but when I talk about that, you almost think that it's the ownership of the medical device technology developers themselves. But in that sector, there's a whole series of different vendors and different third parties involved in the development, just like any other sector, to be honest, that actually develops software, applications, devices. So there is a big supply chain security issue in all of this as well. those are some of the security concerns, what we call the macro drivers actually moving forward, the actual, I suppose, focus on security within these devices themselves. And not only is there a big focus on the security in the devices by the actual developers and also the third-party vendors involved in those developments, but also the regulatory environment is stepping up hugely within this space. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but a lot of these medical device technology providers and their suppliers are now faced with an increasing amount of security requirements around how to build and also deploy a device itself. And the reason why those medical device technology providers and those vendors really are focusing on technologies is not only about the maybe the attacks that they've experienced, but also the actual exposure to identifying a vulnerability that may result in their devices being recalled. So what I'm trying to say is that the devices themselves, yes, they need to be secure, and yes, they need to be able to provide the patient safety that they're ultimately designed to deliver. But ultimately, even if there's not an attack or associated with that device, I give an example of the Medtronic heart monitoring pump just before, even if there is not an attack, there is the actual potential for the recall if a vulnerability is actually identified in that device. That recall obviously has a number of repercussions: financial, legal, reputational, for the medical device organizations and also the vendors that they work with. So these are some of the top information security statistics that we're seeing. So KPMG actually really work quite closely with a lot of the regulators, likes of the UK MHRA and the US FDA, and also global regulators who are equivalent Australia TGA, for example. And what we're seeing is that when we look at the recalls around these devices, the recalls associated with security concerns, some of the big things that are kind of emerging is actually the vulnerabilities being susceptible to malware infecting systems, and also maybe problems with obviously the aging IT hardware. We've got an interesting statistic there, about 67% of malware and also 31% of the aging IT hardware. I'm just picking some examples here. But also kind of the number of vulnerabilities per year. You can see by that graph in the middle of the screen in front of you, you can see that the number of vulnerabilities being identified in these devices is increasing, and it's probably going to increase more so because the global regulators have actually increased the security requirements, which actually allows them to scrutinize the devices a lot more than what's actually probably been done in the past. And then the number of vulnerabilities, which is the bar chart on the right, really interesting. What actually happens, in other words, when there's a vulnerability identified? What's the impact? The biggest one there, 24% loss of data. I've just spoken before about why data is important, what type of data we're talking about. We're talking about your what we call your PPI, your patient personal information. Okay, so when we look at kind of the threats and attacks, the things that are going wrong with these devices, we see a lot of similarity to the devices to what's happening in our traditional operational technology situation. So we're seeing kind of the typical kind of threats, attack vectors, like of the confidentiality attack, a cloud database breach, typical with a lot of those health applications that actually exposes the patient personal information or the patient health information, the PHI. In that we're seeing availability attacks, integrity attacks, physical and remote firmware modification, all of which really quite standard, I would say, if I can use that word, across kind of your IoT, your operational technology, your OT, and maybe other kind of broader cybersecurity threats as well. However, when you look and when you look at the actual nature of those attacks in a little bit more detail, and I will not go into too much information here. Happy to talk to anyone who's interested on a different call or a different scenario to what we're talking about today. But in reality, the medical device attacks and the exposures to these devices are a lot more complicated than what we're seeing in perhaps how we deal with OT security and cybersecurity more broadly. And that's essentially because of the connected nature of those devices. So the IOMT, as I spoke about before, is a connected ecosystem of all these devices. You might, as a person, and on average, every person eventually in their lifetime probably will be connected to about 4 or 5 different devices at any one time in order to manage their healthcare. That's the kind of the going trend. So these are all connected and there's an ecosystem, and there is different kind of scenarios that those devices will be used in, either from your remote or your home to your hospital to where your workplace is. The geographies kind of expand as well. And what I'm just going to say on this one, it depends on the device and the application of that device, its category, in other words, what's it used for. That is really important because the category depends on the types of attacks susceptible to those devices. And because of that, there are a series of different types of, I suppose, controls or ways to actually mitigate those security breaches based on the category of those devices. I'll give you a really quick example and then I'm going to move on. So the psychological monitoring, the ingestible devices that you have now on the market, a lot of people will receive these if they go through various kind of different surgeries. They're all based on what we call in the architectural layers, the perception layer. Effectively, what they're doing, the reason why they're connected is to collect your data. So because they are really geared and designed around the actual perception layer, they are therefore exposed to a number of different threat categories based on what they're programmed to actually deliver. So in other words, the ingestible devices will be a lot more susceptible to eavesdropping or node capture, or what we call zero-day attacks. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but they differ from other devices, for example, robotics or the movement detection sensors, etc. So when we step back and we think, right, yes, security is a concern, we're seeing a lot of recalls. The next question, and what we're seeing across kind of the sector itself, is who has responsibility for security and privacy. So in this ecosystem of all these connected devices, we've got the hospitals, we've got the home, we've got the individual, we've got the medical device technology providers. We've got the vendors and the third-party organisations. We've got the secure communications. We've got the people who actually deliver you the networks. And we've got all of the kind of the firmware users. There is a big picture of kind of an interplay or interlocking of different responsibilities in order to deliver the outcomes, the patient outcomes that's needed. So all these responsibilities actually, at the moment, and things will change, but at the moment, the responsibility mostly lies with the medical technology security providers. And this is through from the design, the development, the verification of those devices, the installment, the operation, i.e. the kind of the end support, and also the post-market, what we call the post-market support. Post-market support is basically when you are using the devices, maybe at home, and you need version updates. that's kind of a good example. So we've got kind of a lot of the responsibility in the medical device technology providers, but all of those other I suppose stakeholders involved in the whole medical device ecosystem are equally responsible for some aspects of security. Now, I'm just going. The reason why I was talking about responsibility is because now, and I did allude to it before, is that there's a big play on achieving some of those security regulatory requirements. And now we know that medical device technology developers, the medtech organization, have got most of those responsibilities. These are the organizations that are taking particular attention to a lot of those regulatory security requirements that are playing out globally in the UK, in the EU, in Canada, US, China, Japan, etc. And the reason why they're doing it is, yes, first to actually improve the security of their devices, also to make sure that they're not going to expose their organizations from experiencing recalls for those devices themselves, but also because if it is a new device, they can't marketize their product in a target country unless they actually comply with a lot of these security requirements. They need these security requirements to be seen as being adhered to in order to sell their products, in other words. Interestingly, over the last 24 months, there has been a step change globally across these countries and others. This is just an example that you've got in front of you of regulators who are changing their security and privacy requirements. I'll just give you one example because that's the EU, the medical device regulation itself. They've gone from 4 pages of medical device security requirements to 42. So this is a big news now, and a lot of organizations now are kind of really stepping up to think, what do I do? Most of these regulators as well have different views on what security should and shouldn't look like as well. And this, just as a final thing, very complicated slide, but it's meant to be complicated. This is just to give you an example of some of those security concerns that are facing medtech organizations, and also those stakeholders that I mentioned before, who also have a responsibility. It is a very complicated landscape of security requirements, and this is why KPMG are doing their utmost to make sure that our clients have got a harmonized view and a clear way through to actually understand how to build, how to deploy, how to secure a post-market secure device. So this is kind of our view, and this is just hot off the press, but this is changing daily. But really what you're seeing is kind of, if you look at that light blue kind of line there, from concept, requirements, design, develop, verification, release, sales, maintenance and operations, and disposal. That's a typical total product life cycle for a medical device. Under that, those purple boxes there, these are some of the security requirements that KPMG have grouped together. These are systemic. It's a harmonized view happening across the globe. These are the ones that are what we're seeing as baseline security requirements. How you address those? Yes, they do have idiosyncrasies based on the countries that you want to market your product into if you're a medical device technology provider, but some of those around risk management, threat assessment, threat modeling, really important stuff. Get that right. It helps obviously with the marketization, but ultimately it helps with actually the security of the devices itself. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your time, and it's been a pleasure, and thank you for Walter for inviting me.
Muchas gracias, Jane, por tu presentación. y muchas gracias a todos por ser parte de esta sesión. Ante cualquier duda, por supuesto, estamos disponibles para que nos hagan llegar sus consultas y con gusto podemos ayudarlos y asistirlos.